So Carlos Sainz, obviously driving for Ferrari, has had a season that hasn't been that great. Definitely not as great as we think he is capable of, or as a lot of people thought he was capable of coming into 2022. But in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into why Carlos Sainz is not an elite F1 driver. But we're going to first start off with his seasons leading up to 2022 to illustrate the type of drivers he was or is as good as, and just where he was performing in terms of the part of the grid he was, at best around between 2015 and 2022. So in 2015, of course, that was his debut season, and he had a pretty good debut season. It was made to look worse because Max Verstappen was his teammate, and obviously Max was 17 years old and was so amazing that year that it made Carlos Sainz look average at best, when he was not average at best by any means. He had a very good year, a few points finishes, obviously had a, I think, was it 5th place finish in qualifying at the Spanish Grand Prix, which was an amazing result, and out-qualified his teammate Max Verstappen, who was alongside him on the 3rd row. It was an amazing qualifying session that weekend for Toro Rosso. And yeah, it was a good, solid first season. In fact, I would say his first season was similar to Lando Norris's first season in 2019, when, of course, Norris was teammate of Carlos Sainz. It wasn't great or very good. It was a decent, solid, maybe at best good debut season. Nothing special, but it got his foot properly in the door and was definitely away when it came to being in Formula 1. But of course, with his team at Max Verstappen being so great, it was pretty hard for Carlos Sainz to properly show just how great he was. And Max Verstappen, as I said, in 2015 was absolutely incredible and was clearly the better driver in 2015, as I will illustrate now. Here is the stats comparing Max Verstappen and Carlos Sainz and what they did in 2015. So in the races, Max Verstappen had 10 races where he finished ahead of Carlos Sainz, and Carlos only had 7. Carlos did do, though, very well against Max in qualifying, 10-9 in qualifying. Verstappen had 49 points to 18, and then Carlos Sainz did have 3 extra DNFs. And I think we do have to remember that with those extra DNFs, Carlos, in terms of who finished ahead of who in the races, would have probably been pretty much equal with Max in that stats at the very top, and would have been a lot closer, obviously, in the points total. But Max Verstappen was definitely the better driver already in 2015, because not only was he in the races, especially beating Sainz, he was getting very good results for the Toro Rosso, 5th place or 4th place results, 7th place, 8th place. When Carlos Sainz finished in the points, it was more like 8th or 9th, which is, considering where Toro Rosso were that year, it was good, but it wasn't at the level of Max Verstappen, which is why Max was the clear number 1 in 2015. But, obviously Max Verstappen, he left Toro Rosso at the end, or not the end of 2015, but, just about into 2016 to replace Daniel Kvyat in the Red Bull team. So Carlos Sainz, who had, I'd say a decent to good 2015 season, he now had a pretty good chance at really showing himself and really showing how good he was, now that he didn't have an absolutely incredible generational talent next to him in Max Verstappen. And for 2016, there would be a slight change for Toro Rosso, which would be they would have year-old engines from Ferrari for 2016, which would help them for the first half of the season. But in the second half of the season, it was expected that they just wouldn't be competitive at all because of those year-old power units. But in 2016, Carlos Sainz was absolutely incredible. In the 21 races we had that season, I believe, in I think 10 of them he finished in the points, and actually midway through the season went on a run where he finished, I think, 8th in like 3 races in a row. I think it was Austria, Silverstone, and then Hungary, I believe. And also, at the very end of that season, finished, I think, 6th at the at the United States Grand Prix. Then I think he finished in 5th or 6th at the Brazilian Grand Prix as well. Again, in a Toro Rosso with a year-old engine, and compared to, obviously, the Mercedes-powered cars, even the Renault-powered cars at the time, it was lacking quite a bit of power. So what Carlos did during that year was incredibly impressive. There is no doubt about that. And he, in 2016, was able to now assert himself properly as one of, I would say, already by the end of 2016, Carlos was one of the top 10 drivers on the grid, given how he finished not too far behind some very good drivers in the championship. Considering the Toro Rosso that year wasn't great, and again, had a year-old power unit, and they had quite a big deficit when it came to power, which back then was very, very important, and still is to a certain extent now, to, Williams and Force India and McLaren kind of at the time towards the end of that season. So, yeah, it was a very, very impressive season for Carlos Sainz. The most impressive race was definitely this one. This is Fernando Alonso overtaking Carlos Sainz at the United States Grand Prix. Sadly, Carlos was robbed of P5 at I think this was the penultimate lap of the Grand Prix, and then Fernando Alonso took it away from him. So just shows you how great Sainz was that year. At the very end of the season, almost getting 5th place in a quite underpowered Toro Rosso car. Even more impressive, though, was how he only finished, I think, 7 points behind Felipe Massa in the championship. Massa, who, wasn't great in 2016, was in a Williams car that was much quicker than the Toro Rosso that year. There is no doubt about that. And only finished 8 points behind Fernando Alonso in the championship, who was in a car that I would say was kind of equal in terms of pace that year. It did ebb and flow at times, but the McLaren and the Toro Rosso cars were pretty much around the same pace in 2016. So for Carlos to only finish that many points behind Fernando, when we know Fernando is clearly a better driver, again, very, very impressive for someone in their second season in F1 to be that good. And then only finished about 30 points behind this man, Nico Hülkenberg, who finished in the top 10 in the championship in a Force India car that we know from that season was way faster and was 3 positions higher, finishing in the Constructors' Championship, yet Carlos was only 30 points behind. So again, a very impressive season, and it illustrated that Carlos Sainz was, without a doubt, at this point, already in his second F1 season, one of the top 10 best drivers on the grid. Was still, I would say, performing at a midfield type level, with your Perez's, Bottas type drivers. He was still in that kind of range. He wasn't quite up there with your, Ricardo's, Verstappen's, Raikkonen's, Vettel's, obviously Hamilton's and Rosberg's at the times. But he was definitely asserting himself as a very good driver and definitely one of the best midfield drivers through the field. And then in 2017, continued to build on that and had a very good 2017 for Toro Rosso. In the first part of that season, finishing the points multiple times in Australia, China, Spain, he finished in the points. I think Monaco, he finished in the top 6 in the Toro Rosso, holding back Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes as well. So had a very good start to that season. Sadly, the Toro Rosso car, in terms of pace, dropped off a lot in the second half of that season. But his performances were now started to catch people's attention, and namely the attention of Renault, because Renault in 2017 had a very good driver in Nico Hülkenberg, but their second driver, Jolyon Palmer, we know, was an absolute just terrible driver. He was nowhere near his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, and Renault were being cost a lot of points they could potentially get that year because Palmer was never really in the points. So in fact, I don't think he finished in the points at all that season. Maybe once in Canada, he may have grabbed a point, but yeah, he was absolutely terrible that year. So Jolyon Palmer was sacked off. Actually, I don't think, is the clip showing? Actually, no, that's the wrong clip. That I want to be showing right now. I think it's actually this one. There you go. There he is. The absolute meme, Jolyon Palmer. Yeah, Jolyon Palmer was absolutely terrible, and Cyril Abiteboul was desperate to get rid of him. I think Jolyon even said that he knew, I think around the Monaco Grand Prix or sometime around there, that Renault were already attempting to make moves and, try and get him out of the team to get someone better in. And that's, of course, what they did for the last, I think, was it 4 races of 2017, where Carlos Sainz joined the Renault team, had a very good debut, finishing ahead of his teammate Nico Hülkenberg. I think in qualifying, I think Hülkenberg might have retired from the race, but he did do a very good overtake. I remember Carlos Sainz in that race going around the outside, I think, of Sergio Perez at that very long right-hand corner, that, I think, triple apex corner at the Circuit of Americas. But a very good debut, finishing in 7th place. I think the most impressive thing, though, with Carlos in 2017 was that he finished ahead of his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, his now teammate at Renault, or teammate at the time with Renault, Nico Hülkenberg, based off of his results for Toro Rosso. And Toro Rosso were definitely slower than Renault in 2017 and finished below Renault in the Constructors' Championship by, I think, quite a bit in terms of points. So it was a very impressive season. Finished 9th in the championship and was only behind the 2 Force Indias, who were pretty dominant in the midfield that year, Perez and Ocon, who were definitely benefiting quite a bit from how good the Force India car was that year. So Carlos Sainz, again, was asserting himself as someone very strong in that midfield pack. But then we came to 2018, a year where Carlos Sainz was expected, now he was driving for a works team, to really start showing just how good of a driver he was and continue to progress upwards. But in 2018, Carlos Sainz, I wouldn't say went backwards, he just didn't really go anywhere. He was very stagnant in this year. He just didn't have a good year really at all, and was quite comfortably beaten by teammate Nico Hülkenberg. And even though at times he did have some bad luck, I remember the French Grand Prix, he was running, I think, in 6th place, and then he had, an ERS issue, and he had to eventually finish in 8th place. There was another race, I think, in Mexico, where he was heading for 6th or 7th, and then he had a problem with his car. So he was cost probably 10 to 20 points during the season with some reliability problems. But when you look at the head-to-head, as we'll get into now, it wasn't really that close between Hülkenberg and Sainz, when Sainz really should have been beating Nico Hülkenberg. Here is the head-to-head. So in the races, Carlos Sainz was just about beating Hülkenberg, but it was basically equal. In qualifying, though, Hülkenberg quite clearly ahead of Carlos Sainz, scoring 16 extra points, and Hülkenberg had 5 more DNFs in 2018. So let's say you take off 3 of those DNFs for Hülkenberg, then Hülkenberg would have been probably beating Sainz in the races by 1 or 2, and would have been, instead of 16 points ahead of Carlos, probably would have been 25 to 30 points ahead. So Nico Hülkenberg quite comfortably beat Carlos Sainz in 2018, and that was a shock. I remember going into 2018, I did not think at all that Carlos Sainz was going to be beaten by Hülkenberg. I thought Sainz would show, as he did for Toro Rosso, just how good of a driver he was and that he did deserve, a move up the field, but just didn't materialize for Carlos. And that what that saw was Carlos now going into 2019, where he was now going to be racing for a new team, McLaren, obviously, where he was replacing Fernando Alonso for that year. He was now going into 2019 having to kind of save his reputation and keep his career on track and moving forward, because 2018 definitely didn't move his career forward, but kind of derailed it because his progress just stopped in 2018. We didn't see really anything better from Carlos, I guess you could say, in the 2018 season, and would have teammate Lando Norris as his teammate, someone who was very good as a junior and obviously in F2. So Carlos had to assert himself in 2019 to make sure he kept his career moving forward and to make sure that his time at McLaren was a success. And for Carlos, it was. And I'll just leave you with this onboard lap of Carlos at the Russian Grand Prix, where I think he qualified in 5th or 6th place that weekend. He had a great year for McLaren, finished in 6th place in the Drivers' Championship. Definitely helped massively to leading McLaren to 4th in the Constructors. That was McLaren's best year in the Constructors' Championship since, 2012. So Carlos was a massive help towards that with brilliant drives, and certainly towards the end of that season, his consistency was absolutely incredible. And I think most impressive, even though the two drivers who were in the Red Bull that year, Pierre Gasly for the first half of the season and then Alex Albon for the second half, even though those two weren't that impressive, to beat both of those drivers in the championship in a car that was much slower than the Red Bull was a very impressive thing. And it was a great season for Carlos, and was now starting to really get his career moving forward and putting his name forward as a potential driver for a Ferrari or a Mercedes or a Red Bull type team in terms of being a front running team. And it was absolutely brilliant for the Spaniard. Obviously finished on the podium in Brazil, was awarded obviously after the Grand Prix, but a great podium it was. From the back of the grid he came in Brazil to finish in 3rd place. Plenty of great overtakes as well to get up to podium positions, and was consistently in the points, not just finishing in the points, but was always in, say, 5th, 6th, or even 7th place in the McLaren. And I think without Carlos Sainz being that great that year, or as great as he was that year, I don't think McLaren would have finished 4th that year. Lando Norris was good in 2019. I wouldn't say he was great, but I think Carlos's consistent, maybe not greatness, but just consistently very good performances is what got McLaren 4th in the championship that year. Because it's not like McLaren were always much quicker than Renault. They were quicker than Renault in 2019, but they weren't massively quicker. It was still kind of close between the two teams. And even at times, you had a Toro Rosso be close to those teams as well. So Carlos really had to have the great season he had to get McLaren 4th in the championship, and that's exactly what he did. And going into 2020, like I said, he now put himself forward for possible opportunities for front-running teams, such as the Ferrari team. And if I just quickly show this on screen, if it'll let me, there you go. It was reported that Carlos Sainz, towards the end of that year, already had talks with Ferrari in regards to contracts and, possible moves. And obviously at the end of 2019, we didn't think that Carlos was going to go anywhere, but obviously that did change quite a bit. As for 2021, and during the first half of 2020, when there was no F1 season because of the COVID outbreak and the pandemic really beginning, Carlos Sainz was officially announced at Ferrari in May of 2020 to join Ferrari for 2021, replacing Sebastian Vettel for that year in the Ferrari. And to be honest, at the time, given that Sebastian Vettel was not performing as well as he had done in the past and was definitely past his prime, it was the right decision to put Carlos in the Ferrari. There's no doubt about it. He did deserve the opportunity now to prove himself at a top team, because in 2019, he was the best driver out of that midfield pack. There is no doubt about it. And if you perform at that level, you know, the best of the midfield pack of cars or drivers, whatever you want to call it, you do deserve your chance then, I think, at a top team. And in 2020, Carlos Sainz would continue to build on what he did. He had another great season. The first half of the season, he was a bit unlucky and didn't have real consistency because of some of that bad luck. But once we got to the last, I think, 8-9 races of the season, Carlos Sainz was consistently up there in the top 5, top 6 in the race results. And that is really what helped McLaren get third in the championship in 2020. Lando Norris obviously did play a big part. His results in the first half of the season especially really helped McLaren give them a big boost at the start of the season to get them, you know, nice and high in the Constructors' Championship. But what really finished off the job was Carlos Sainz's sheer consistency in 2020, or the end of 2020, where he was consistently always up there for the McLaren team. And yeah, got them third in the championship. And it was a good, I guess, present for the McLaren team that he gave them. Obviously, McLaren gave him a lot of a better of a car than, you know, McLaren had previously, which really did help his performances. But it was great that Carlos was able to deliver again for the McLaren team. Now, in 2020, one thing I will say is I don't think 2020, even though he was unlucky at times, I don't think it was as good of a season for him as 2019. The reason I say that is because he finished behind Sergio Perez and Daniel Ricciardo, two other drivers in the midfield pack who I think did perform better than him in 2020. Again, it was a great season for Sainz, but just wasn't at the very front of that midfield pack like he was in 2019. Still, he beat the Red Bull of Alex Albon. I think they finished level on points, but he finished ahead because he had a better race result of second compared to Alex Albon, who I think had a best race result third that year. So that's why he beat Alex Albon that year. So that was great, you know, beating, again, a Red Bull driver. And the Red Bull was definitely much quicker than the McLaren, but it wasn't quite as good as 2019, but still a very good season. And we'll get on to those Ferrari pictures in a moment. His record against Lando Norris during those 2 years at McLaren before he joined the Ferrari team was quite impressive, considering the amount of hype Lando Norris came with into Formula One. And especially in that second season, Lando Norris performed very well, yet Carlos still finished ahead of Lando in the championship in 2020, and of course did pretty clearly in 2019 as well. So it was a very impressive time he had at McLaren, getting the best really that he could out of that car. Don't think he really could have got any more out of that car. Maybe the odd race here or there he wasn't at his absolute best, but to be honest, I think he did the absolute best he could. And compared to Lando Norris, who, yes, he has improved since Norris, what he did, Carlos, was absolutely fantastic, and we'll get onto that now. So this is Carlos Sainz versus Lando Norris in their time at McLaren and the key stats. So in qualifying, Norris was just ahead of Carlos Sainz. In the races, though, that's where Carlos really shone the brightest, and that is where Carlos does shine the brightest, period. He's always better in the races, I feel, than he is in qualifying. And I think he just, I don't know, race conditions just suit him better than qualifying conditions. And when it came to points scored, when Carlos finished the points, it was normally a lot bigger than what Norris scored for the McLaren team. Carlos had, 2 podiums, I think, for McLaren during that time, 2019 and 2020. And Lando had 1, I think, in Austria in 2020. So yeah, Carlos, when he finished in the points, like I said, it was always bigger points than what Lando was able to achieve, and their DNFs were equal. So comparing Sainz and Norris in 2020, or 2020 and 2019, Carlos was the better driver. And going into his time at Ferrari, he was, I think, arguably one of the top 5 drivers on the grid. I think you could definitely have made that argument. Maybe 6th best driver on the grid, maybe at the absolute worst, the 7th best driver on the grid. But he was definitely in that conversation now and was clearly deserving of a place at Ferrari. But what he needed to do when he went to Ferrari was now prove that he could make that next step to becoming, instead of just a very good driver, one of the elite in Formula 1, and had a teammate in Charles Leclerc who was, or is now, but already kind of was at the time, an elite F1 driver because of just his sheer speed and his talent. So had a great benchmark to see just how great he was. And we'll now get on to his Ferrari time. And there you go. And yeah, Carlos Sainz had a very good 2021 season. Was in the first half of the season, he wasn't, again, it was kind of similar to 2020, wasn't consistent in the first half of that season, but he did eventually get going. And when he did, his consistency again is what led to a very good season for Spaniard. And he had an amazing season, to be honest. He finished 5th in the Drivers' Championship and did finish a few points ahead of Charles Leclerc in the championship as well. As I'll get onto in a moment, that doesn't tell the whole story, because Leclerc, wasn't it wasn't a totally fair fight, I guess you could say, because Leclerc, had a couple issues here or there. But it was a great season for Carlos Sainz. Even if Charles Leclerc had beaten Carlos in that season, Carlos still performed at a very high level because he would have been, very close still to Charles Leclerc in the championship. And for him to be on the podium, I think, was it 3 times that year? Or 3 or 4 times that season? I think it was 4 times that season in a Ferrari car that was, at best, the 3rd quickest car on the grid. At times, the 4th quickest car on the grid was an amazing achievement. It was a brilliant season for Carlos Sainz. And honestly, I would say 2021 is the best season that Carlos Sainz had in Formula 1, because he beat Charles Leclerc in the championship and was so close to Leclerc in that season. And to finish, in the top 5 of the championship, even beating his ex-teammate Lando Norris in the championship as well, who we know from last year had such a great season. And the McLaren car, probably for the first half of that season, maybe the first 3 quarters of that season, was the quicker car. So for Carlos to beat Norris still in the championship just shows how great of a season he had. This is how quickly Sainz and Leclerc compared for 2021. And this is why I say that, that context does matter in regards to, when Carlos Sainz finished ahead of Charles Leclerc, we do have to remember the context and some of the stats. So again, Charles Leclerc finished ahead of Carlos Sainz in 4 more races than Sainz did. 13-9 there. Then it was 13-9 for Leclerc in qualifying as well. So when it came to head-to-head purely races and qualifying, Leclerc was still better. But it was close. It wasn't like it has been this season, really, as I'll get on to in a moment, where it's been clearly Charles Leclerc being the better driver. Carlos Sainz, though, was able to consistently be in the top 5, top 6 in the races, and that's why he was able just about to finish ahead of Charles Leclerc in the Drivers' Championship. Also, Leclerc had 2 DNFs in 2021. Carlos Sainz had 0, which is very impressive, I have to say, to have 0 DNFs in a Formula 1 season. But yeah, it was a great season for Sainz, but again, we have to remember in context that Leclerc was, I think, still slightly better than Sainz in the 2021 season, but that doesn't diminish how great Carlos Sainz was. But what this meant going into 2022, the new regulations where Ferrari were expected to be pretty competitive, it was expected that if Ferrari were competitive, that Carlos Sainz now would be able to be a title contender. And it was going to really show 2022 whether Carlos Sainz was now properly an elite F1 driver. And as we know from pre-season testing, and I'll just try and quickly find the clip. There you go. As we know from pre-season testing, Ferrari did have the best car on the grid. I think at that point of the season, I think pretty much everyone would have to agree they did have the best car on the grid. And really this season, they've been as good as Red Bull. Maybe you could argue they've been quicker than Red Bull, certainly in qualifying, but they have definitely had a car easily good enough to contend for a world championship. So this was the chance really to see, how good Carlos Sainz was. The first couple races that season, he didn't do too bad. Completed a Ferrari 1-2 in Bahrain, finished third in Saudi Arabia. So, didn't do too bad in Sainz. But then it unraveled, or, really begun to unravel at the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne. And here is that mistake that Carlos Sainz made. Didn't have a good qualifying because his team sent him out with not long enough left for him to really do a good enough effort, and he ended up qualifying in P9, and then he started on the hard compound tyres, and that's what led to him there spinning out of the Grand Prix. And then at Imola in qualifying, had a crash. I got to say, this mistake was pretty poor. The Australian Grand Prix one as well was a very poor mistake, a very simple one. This is also very simple, just spinning, I think, on the just turning the car too drastically and maybe spinning on a damp patch. Again, a mistake that a driver of his quality should not be making. And then in the race, he was punted off by Daniel Ricciardo, which was a shame, but if he had qualified better, that wouldn't have happened, because obviously he finished in the sprint race in 4th place, when if he had not made that mistake in Friday qualifying, he would have ended up probably 3rd on the grid, so would have avoided Daniel Ricciardo. And then at the Spanish Grand Prix, a couple races after that, whilst in 3rd place, spun in the gravel and ended up finishing eventually in 4th place. But the thing is, with Charles Leclerc's engine failure and Max Verstappen's, Max Verstappen's spin as well in the gravel, if Carlos Sainz had not made that mistake, Carlos probably would have won the Grand Prix in Spain, obviously his home Grand Prix. So it was a very poor mistake. And then pretty much after that mistake in Spain, Carlos started to be more consistent and recover some consistency, some pace, and did improve his performances. But even when he did, he just simply hasn't been good enough and hasn't been on that properly elite level compared to Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen. He just hasn't been good enough. The only races this season that he's really been, I would say, properly competitive with Leclerc or Max was probably, Miami. It's certainly in qualifying. Monaco, definitely. Canada, obviously Silverstone, where he won that Grand Prix. And also Austria, which was helped a bit by the Ferrari pace, but he was pretty quick there. And also Hungary as well. And that's 5 or 6 races I've listed off, which is about just under 50% of the races so far. If you're going to be a properly elite F1 driver, you've got to be competitive with Verstappen and Leclerc at 85-90% of the races. You can't be only 50% of the time or 30 or 40% of the time competitive with Leclerc and Max. You've got to be much more competitive than that. And simply, Carlos Sainz just hasn't been able to match what Max and Leclerc can do. And I'll prove with some data here. Comparing Leclerc and Sainz so far this season, in the races, they're level 6 apart. The reason it only adds up there to 12 is because, obviously, in Baku, they both retired from the race, so nobody won there out of that battle between the two teammates. But we all know the reason Charles Leclerc is level there with Carlos Sainz in terms of who has finished where in the races is because Charles Leclerc has been screwed over so heavily. Not that Carlos Sainz hasn't, I may add. Carlos Sainz has been screwed over horribly as well, In Austria, for example, with the engine blow up, he, really could have, he would have had probably second place in that Grand Prix and has been screwed at other points of the season. Like I said, in qualifying in Melbourne, where the team sent him out too late and then he couldn't get his tyres fired up properly to do a good final run after his first run was affected by a red flag. Carlos has been hampered by Ferrari as well, but not to the extent that Charles Leclerc has. In qualifying, it's 10-3 in Leclerc's favour. When you consider that in qualifying in 2021, I'll go back to that quick, it was overall for the season 13-9, but it was still pretty close. Leclerc was only winning that battle, or was only ahead of Carlos Sainz, say, 60% of the time. When you compare that to 2022, it's more like, 75-80% of the time that Leclerc is ahead of Sainz in qualifying. Just not good enough, I'm afraid, from Carlos. Obviously, Leclerc has 3 wins. Carlos only has 1. And when it comes to podiums, I think it just shows how Leclerc's been screwed over so bad this year. Carlos has more podiums than Leclerc this season. When we know Leclerc would have had, obviously, a podium in Spain, in Monaco, in Baku, and Silverstone, and Hungary, if he had not been screwed over by his team. So it looks deceiving, these stats, but when you consider the actual context, you can easily tell that Charles Leclerc is, this season, much better than Carlos Sainz, and has proven to be much better than Carlos Sainz. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And then we'll compare Verstappen and Sainz as well so far this season, obviously in 2 different teams, but still worth comparing. So in the races, Verstappen 9-4 over Sainz, a bit more competitive, or slightly more competitive rather, in qualifying. And it has been, with Max and Carlos, normally a lot closer in qualifying than it is in the races, which is not necessarily down to Carlos being poor in the races, because obviously the Ferrari car in every Grand Prix so far this season hasn't been quite as quick as Red Bull. In some races, Ferrari are quicker, in some they're not. So it's not necessarily down to Sainz, but it is normally a lot more competitive between Max and Carlos in qualifying. But you can see Verstappen has had 8 wins this season out of 13 races, just incredible. Carlos only 1. And even though Carlos has had 2 extra DNFs, it wouldn't have really made a massive difference to the stats here. And when you consider the Ferrari and Red Bull cars have been pretty much equal on pace, or around about the same on pace, again, Max Verstappen clearly ahead of Carlos Sainz when it comes to this battle. And Carlos Sainz clearly not as good as Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. That is clear to see from what we've seen this season and the stats, and from how obviously the championship standings look. And the reason obviously I looked at, Carlos Sainz's build up to 2022 is, again, because there was a pattern in that Carlos, at best, especially in 2019, 2020, 2021, was at best at the front of the, or the front of the pack of very good drivers, not the, absolute elite drivers in Formula One. Your Lewis Hamiltons, Max Verstappen's, Charles Leclerc's, and say Fernando Alonso, you can put on that as well. Carlos Sainz was at the upper part of the pack behind, so the second tier, which I kind of did in my Lando Norris video, showing the different tiers of drivers for the entire grid. And coming into this season, the hope was that Carlos would elevate himself to that top tier up there with Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, and Charles Leclerc, and arguably you could say at times Fernando Alonso, based off what Alonso is doing at the moment. But Carlos this season has proven that he is not an elite F1 driver. He isn't quick enough over a single lap. He is consistent when it comes to the races, but he is also consistently not good enough. And it, doesn't have as good an overtaking ability as Leclerc and Max. Isn't really as strong in fighting for position, I would say, as Max and Leclerc. And just isn't on their level. That is clear to see from this season. And, obviously Carlos Sainz has still, plenty of years in his F1 career left. He can make improvements, but compared to Max and Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, I don't really see what improvements he can make because, because of how many years he's been in Formula One, this is kind of who he is as a driver. He's a quick driver, a consistent racer. He's reliable to a certain extent. And, he is a very good F1 driver. But just isn't, again, as quick and as talented as those top three. That is pretty clear to see. The only other thing that I think Carlos has been lacking this year, and that he is lacking compared to the elite F1 drivers in Formula One, is when Carlos made those mistakes, such as this one in Melbourne that I'll show again, Carlos isn't able to bounce back from those mistakes as quickly as a Lewis, a Max, or a Charles Leclerc can. For example, when Leclerc spun in the first part of qualifying in Barcelona, he bounced back immediately and got pole position by 0.3 of a second. And we saw with Max Verstappen as well in Hungary. Had a spin after passing Leclerc for the net lead of the race. Forgot about it, got on with it, passed Leclerc again and won the Grand Prix. With Carlos, it's almost as if he doesn't quite believe in himself as much as Max and Leclerc do, and maybe gets a bit too down with himself to really get back on it like the absolute elite drivers can when they make those rare mistakes. So I think that's the only thing Carlos could really improve upon, to be honest, with his, the areas of his game, I guess you could say. But the other areas of his game are good, are very good, but again, they're just not on that absolute elite level with Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, or Lewis Hamilton. He just isn't as good as those drivers. And what I think Carlos Sainz is someone who, and it's sad to say this because I've been a big Carlos Sainz fan for a while, Carlos Sainz is someone who would be a very good number 2 driver for a team, just like Valtteri Bottas was at Mercedes and Kimi Raikkonen was to a certain extent at Ferrari. And we'll get on to Kimi in a second because I am actually going to compare the two. That's what he can be, a very good number 2 driver who complements, the number 1 driver and is able to get some very good results for the team as long as the team is not making as many mistakes as Ferrari do. But he will never be fighting properly for the championship with those absolute elite drivers that I've mentioned before. Let's say if he was to drop down from a top team, he would still be a very good acquisition for a midfield team like an Alpine, or if McLaren ever wanted him back, or Aston Martin even in the future. He'd be a very good acquisition for those teams because he is, very good compared to those, say, second tier type drivers just below the elite F1 drivers, such as your Lando Norris's, Daniel Ricciardo's, George Russell's. Like, he's very competitive and close with those people, so he would be a very good acquisition for those type of teams, but he just isn't going to be on that very top tier level, which is sad, but it is the truth. And basically, looking towards his future, Carlos Sainz, this is what I see really for Carlos Sainz in the future. If he stays at a front-running team, he will be the number 2 complementary driver. Again, like your Valtteri Bottas and your Sergio Perez. I do believe he is better than a Valtteri Bottas and a Sergio Perez, by the way. I'm not saying he is as good as those. I think he is better than both of them. But that is the type of role that I think he really will be playing at a number 1 type team. And will basically have the same role that Kimi Raikkonen had at Ferrari in 2017 and 2018, where most of the time Kimi was fighting for 3rd and 4th place, but occasionally there'd be a weekend where Kimi would finish in 2nd or would fight for pole position, fight for the win, even got pole position in Monaco in 2017 and at Monza in 2018 as well. And, had those occasional great moments. That is what will happen for Carlos Sainz as long as he's driving for the Ferrari team. Carlos Sainz will have the occasional pole position, race win. He'll have plenty of podiums as long as Ferrari remain as competitive as they are now. But he will never be, again, championship level driver and will never be on that absolute top tier, which is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can still have a very good F1 career and not be one of the elite in your era. Jenson Button wasn't one of the absolute elite in F1 during his time, I don't think. Maybe at best he might have just about strayed into that area, but he was always not as good as your Vettels, Hamiltons, Alonso's, or arguably, Mark Webber's, say about 10 years ago. And then in the mid-2000s, he wasn't quite as good as your, obviously, Michael Schumacher's, Fernando Alonso's, and Kimi Raikkonen's. There's nothing wrong with not being on that elite level, but because of the hype, going into 2022 and coming out 2021 that Carlos Sainz was now properly going to be able to be a title contender, I think 2022 has clearly shown us that Carlos Sainz is not on that level. But guys, let me know in the comment section, what do you believe about Carlos Sainz? Do you disagree? Do you think he is an elite F1 driver? Do you agree with me that he just isn't, and that the best he can be is a complimentary number 2 driver? And for his F1 career, what do you believe is possible for him? Do you think, like me, that the best he can get is, a few race wins, a load of podiums, and maybe a few pole positions? Or do you think he can do better than that in his F1 career? Let me know in the comment section down below. But guys, until my next video has been me, ChazzaHD, goodbye.